I had been hired for my hands more than my name. In the paperwork I filled out at Building 1, I was a field engineer with an electrical specialty, a contractor trained to do maintenance and systems diagnostics on hardware that had to work in a place without air. The title slid easily under the broader umbrella of mission support, which sounded harmless enough. My background was not glamorous. I had come up through a municipal utility in Ohio, then into avionics testing, learning the patience of oscilloscopes and the quiet arrogance of calibrated instruments. You respect a gauge only after you've watched it drift and learned why. When I first saw the lunar module up close, what struck me was not its myth, but its fragility. Mylar quilts, hand-laid wiring, connectors that reminded me of the inside of a refrigerator wrapped around a miracle. The LM wasn't beautiful. It was accurate. That was enough for me. In the weeks before launch, I lived inside checklists. The binder for my part of the mission weighed more than the tools in my kit. I memorized procedural phrases until they lost meaning, only to say them again to make them real. Verify continuity, compare temporize, time to lock, safe the circuit, ground strap on, pressure suit check. The routine made a boundary. It kept the improbable at bay. If you asked me then why I slept well, I would have told you that I trusted protocols the way sailors trust depth charts. The sea was still indifferent, but I knew the numbers. The justification for me being attached to Apollo 16 was a materials trial that never made it into the public-facing press kits. On internal diagrams, it was a thin gray box labeled with an acronym I was told not to say out loud. I knew its wiring harness as if I'd braided it myself because I had, in a clean room with filtered air and blue wrist ground pads. The official line was that I would be advising on deployment of extended seismic experiments and diagnosing any in situ faults. Off the record, the director of the little office that owned my contract told me there were contingencies. If I heard this twice, I assured myself it would begin to sound less like a threat. It never did. The mission profile felt like a ritual with teeth. We left behind the oxygen smell of the Cape. We left behind fog on the vehicle assembly building windows. We left behind friends who took pictures and then pretended not to know how to pray. You don't prepare for weightlessness. The blood goes where it wants. Your inner ear renegotiates its contract. I fell into the rhythms everyone knew by heart. Attitude adjustments by the numbers, coasting, checking, the maternal tone of Houston leveling out the human noise. The entry into lunar orbit felt like we were making a decision together with the machine. I didn't have the right to be sentimental, so I wasn't. The moon filled the window like a pale topography model, and then replaced the window altogether. I kept my mind tight to procedures. We were just going to do a job in a high place. The landing site, Descartes Highlands, looked like a geology department diagram from the 50s, hummocky, ridged, bright. Dust became a presence before it was a substance. It hovered around the LM's footpad in a slow boil that had no air to carry it, and yet it moved. We rehearsed the extravehicular steps until muscle memory felt like memory. I told myself that my involvement would be small and domestic in scale. Check a connector, verify a signal, adjust a deployment angle. There was nothing heroic in it. The surface walked back at you with each step. The regolith took your boot print as both a courtesy and a threat. I fell in love with the sound of my own breathing because it told me I hadn't made a fatal miscalculation. We set up the ALSEP packages, stabbed poles, drew lines, took pictures. Every action had weight because it had time attached to it. How long a patient line drew in the dust, how long a tool took to drift to your hand. I noticed how the rover's tracks looked too crisp, like graphite lines. The work took up whole human minutes, and that felt merciful. What I saw next might have slid past if it hadn't betrayed a rule. Rocks on the moon did not glint. The sun never twinkled in the vacuum. But at the shadow line near a shallow depression, there was a point of brightness that wasn't a reflection so much as a reply. I tested my instinct against procedure. I moved toward it with the small hop that felt like a lie told to gravity. The depression had the geometry of a scuffed heel, too smooth to be natural, but I told myself the wind and water we know on Earth can't teach you all the ways that surfaces can settle. The dust crusted oddly at the rim, and beneath the crust, something had packed itself, then been unpacked, then packed again by time. I brushed more dust away and put my glove against what lay there. It was a sphere a little bigger than a basketball, a shade of metal that wasn't one thing or another. Pewter, gunmetal, something cooler that drank sunlight and made something else out of it. On one side there was an arrangement like a panel, not quite flush, not quite separate, the join line neither welded nor assembled. Inscribed across its skin were characters sharper than dust should allow. When I looked directly, they froze, angular, clean. When I glanced away to check my line, to check the tilt of my wrist, they shifted like ants deciding on a new path. The human brain is not good at admitting it is out of spec. Mine found other explanations, and then discarded them because there wasn't enough oxygen for lies. I called it in with my voice steady, as if I were asking for a torque spec. The answer from the other suits on the circuit carried a tone I recognized from cores brought up with fossils in them, a prickled quiet. We had a protocol for unknowns. Put it in a bag. If it won't go in a bag, put the bag over it. If it emits, note the emission. If the emission exceeds baseline, withdraw. The tool for the bag, a telescoping hoop, clicked against the metal in a way that felt like tapping a tuning fork. I only heard it in my bones. I touched the sphere again because the hoop wouldn't get under the rim, and I wanted to lever it clean. The instant I set my glove on that not-quite seam, the inside of my helmet vibrated with a single low note that seemed too large for the space it lived in. The sound wasn't transmitted. I knew that by the way it didn't arrive through radio discipline, it just existed on both sides of my ears. All the quartz watches on our wrists halted. The rover's diagnostic light went flat. The little pips on the comm loop, the reassuring metronome of a working loop, stopped their pipping and left behind a silent carrier that made my teeth feel heavy. Before I said anything, I felt time become viscous around me, not in an emotional sense, but in a way my hands had learned from fluid dynamics. Thicker, slower, clinging to surfaces. Charles, our other human on the ground, a man I will call that because he deserves a name and because I still won't put his birth certificate into a story he cannot correct, stiffened, and then went to his knees. The dust responded to him like a patient animal. He said, in a voice that didn't know what volume meant anymore, that he could see the birth and the death of the sun at once, that it folded like a hinge. His visor reflected my visor, which reflected his visor, an infinite mirrored stack of thin, careful lives. The note faded without fading, which is the only way I can say it. The world resumed its crayons dragging along the comm. The rover light remembered itself. Our watches did not. The face on mine sat at a time I would come to know too well. I reported an anomaly in the blandest tone I could secure. I fed words like transient and localized into the circuit like I was paying a toll. The measure of what we had put our hands on did not fit inside nouns I could trust. The panel line on the sphere had widened a fraction, and I hated the part of me that could measure that without measuring what it meant. We made the bag fit by denying several laws of geometry, and by pretending that a hoop could be a concept rather than a tool. Charles breathed like someone climbing a hill. He said he was fine. His voice said he had left enough of himself sitting in the dust to make that a lie. I hauled the bagged object onto the rover deck, and the tie-down strap slid home as if it had wanted this shape. I glanced once more at the inscriptions and watched a diagonal become an arc when I pretended not to look. I think that was when I realized the sphere wasn't a list. It was a schedule, and it had noticed me reading it. We got it to the LM and inside as if we were bringing in something that smelled bad. The thing didn't weigh the way I expected. It had lunar weight, yes, but it carried a reluctance that shows up in bearings when lubrication fails. The cabin looked small around it. We used tape. Everyone uses tape. even when they're pretending they've solved everything with plans. I filed our report with the precision of a guilty man. We slept because muscles demanded it, not because our minds did. When I closed my eyes, I felt like I had lain my head on a refrigerator, humming in an empty kitchen. The mission moved on as if momentum itself insisted. We finished our traverses. The moon lost none of its quiet honesty because of what we'd found. That felt unfair. In the return craft, strapped back toward Earth, I caught myself waiting for that note to return like a pressure change before a storm. The capsule answered our manipulations without complaint. On the loop, the ground sounded like the ground always sounded. Calm, hungry, precise. There was a human missing in that calm. I knew he had spoken to me on the surface. In the transcripts handed to me, there was a space where he should have been. His name thinned until it was a shape for putting other names into. In a meeting, I was asked to confirm we had all returned safely. I said yes, because the word had a definition that would not let me say no in public. Quarantine felt like being put into a well-lit terrarium. Doctors took our pulses like people looking for something else under our skin. The things they measured were an excuse to look at what they could not measure. They bled us by vials and returned nothing but bland numbers. One physician introduced himself as Dr. Alan Fletcher and wore his kindness with the practiced ease of a man used to compliance. He used terms like sleep hygiene and neural fatigue, and brought with him small tablets in white envelopes, labeled with codes rather than the names of chemicals. I recognized the handwriting of the person who had written the codes. Names are for things we admit to owning. The drug he offered me in dissolving form had a chilled bitterness that suggested a strong affinity for proteins. He told me it would help consolidate my memories. He was almost right. At home, my watch on the dresser face insisted on 1 carved hour. I tried to set it, and the stem resisted, like a frozen nut on a rusted bolt. I began to carry a little composition notebook because I did not trust this brain to hold oil. At odd times, I would run a finger over the page and find a sentence I didn't remember writing in my hand, about a humming I didn't hear at that moment. My wife at that time, she deserves a biography of her own, looked at me and saw a quieter man. Quiet looked like safety to her. It did not feel that way to me. I went back to Building 31 where the samples and the serious secrets lived. Security had the warm efficiency of a hotel trying to pretend it wasn't empty in off-season. I signed in with a badge that made a little sound on the reader. People who knew me by my shirt and coffee preference nodded without inviting me into their eyes. In a side lab, behind a second door that sighed, sat the object. It had not enjoyed transport. Its panel line had scabbed over into a line that looked less like a seam and more like a closed eyelid. Up close, the inscriptions had found more to say. Where there had been sharp shapes, now there were curves linking them, as if connectors had grown between previously unrelated events. I stood there with the good posture of someone about to lie and took a small recorder from my pocket. I put it on the bench and let it listen. The linguist they introduced me to came in with a legal pad and a suspicion of machines that I found immediately reassuring. Doctor. Helen Rourke carried her hair in a braid that had more to do with lab safety than style, and had the habit of writing with her whole hand, not her fingers. She looked at the sphere with her head tilted in a way that made me trust her neck more than her eyes. She didn't bother to ask me what I thought it meant. She drew the symbols and then drew lines between them that didn't exist on the object. She made small notes in the margins. Train schedule, pulse train, not Leximi, procedural. I told her about the vibration in my helmet. She asked what frequency. I told her I thought around 40 hertz, but that felt too neat. She said it wasn't trying to be language. It was trying to be us, but more reliable. That was the first time I felt gratitude like a bruise. We worked in the way quiet people do when they are worried about making noise. I played the recorder in the lab. At first, there was only room tone and the lazy chatter of ventilation. Then, Buried inside that, a beat like a low metronome that had been recorded in a larger room. It was not a whistle or a tone so much as the shape of a tone. Helen matched it in pencil. Tick, tick, long, tick, long, long, tick. She circled the long gaps. Instructions, she said. Not description, conditions, gate pulses. She drew a small diagram of a flip-flop, and then she drew the same diagram again as a pair of stars. I woke one morning and realized I had lost a night without the usual films of sleep. The Mnemosyne, no one called it that officially, but the nickname made the rounds anyway, had the virtue of honesty. It took not only what I did not want, but some of what I did. I sat on the couch with my notebook open and found where my hand had written in careful block letters that I should not trust any recording after 0200. I checked the timestamp on my attempt to copy the lab audio and found that it had stopped copying at 2:03 a.m., mid-transfer, not with an error but with a blank patch that looked like a plate removed from a wall. The progress bar had halted at 83% and then evaporated. I was not surprised, but the lack of surprise scared me more than the loss. Then someone knocked at my door, 3 precise raps like someone confirming the presence of a stud in drywall. It was Dr. Fletcher, hands empty, smile in place. He had a new envelope of medicine. He told me they had noticed my sleep pattern from the monitors they had not told me about and that I might benefit from a dose adjustment. I let him into my living room because that was the sort of person I was then. He sat on the edge of the chair like a man demonstrating how to sit on the edge of a chair. He asked after my dreams in a tone that suggested he collected them. I told him they were empty. He told me emptiness could be restful. He was both wrong and dangerous. When he left, my inbox held an email from an account that should not have existed anymore. The subject line read, "I still see it." The sender line carried a name that had been smudged out of debriefings and transcripts. The timestamp on the email said it had been sent 3 days earlier at exactly the time my watch at home refused to move past. The body of the message was one sentence. "It won't choose a star unless you do." There was no signature. The address did not resolve when I tried to answer. I did not tell anyone at work about it. When you work around people who search for anomalous signals, you learn to recognize when you are the signal. I met Helen again the next day in a coffee place that tried to convince itself it was a lab by letting people do math on napkins. She had slept badly and, like me, had found new sentences she didn't remember writing. She slid a sheet across to me. On it, she had drawn the inscriptions as we had last seen them, but with annotations about rate and direction of change. She had linked certain changes to times we had walked away from the object and pretended not to look. Avoidance made it talk to itself. Observation made it hold still. That felt like a different set of rules than quantum mechanics, but it rhymed. I asked her what she thought it wanted to do. She tapped a box she had drawn around 3 of the most stubborn characters. "It's waiting," she said, "for alignment, not planetary, something larger." The attempt to share what we had was clumsy because I didn't believe myself capable of subterfuge. I sent a message to a man named Daniel Kessler, who owed me nothing and was owed less by the world, and whose instinct for patterns in public records made him a kind of unlicensed epidemiologist of human behavior. I met him once in a line where we both pretended to like a brand of donut. He wasn't a friend, which made me think he might still listen to me. I put the audio in a compressed file, added the photos Helen had traced from, encrypted it, and pressed send. The progress bar slid across with confidence until the last little sliver, where it stopped like a mule at a bridge. A minute later, my modem clicked, old reflexes obeying a new master, and the connection died. When it returned on its own, the file name had changed by 1 letter, and the contents were the sort of cheerful clip art you send people when they have a new baby. The replacement felt like 2 insults at once. The next time I stood by the sphere, it smelled like hot dust, even though that wasn't a thing it could do. Helen ran a finger over the margin of her pad the way a violinist tunes. "Look," she said, and circled two characters that had not been neighbors before. The shape that emerged felt like a schematic for a switch that would never be built on Earth. I leaned in and watched as a small diagonal flicked into a curve. I turned my head. It flicked back. The lab was quiet enough that the refrigerator in the break room seemed to be auditioning for a part in our lives. The humming began again, not in my ears, but in the skin just behind them, where someone might place a hand to steer you gently out of a room. In the hum, I could hear a new pattern. The long gaps had changed. The signal shifted, as if finding room to breathe. Helen wrote the new beat down. We looked at each other because we knew changes had consequences. Then all the overhead fluorescents flickered and stayed on with a tired determination. Somewhere in the building, a contactor had decided to retire early. The pattern changed again. I didn't trust the people I was supposed to trust, but I still wanted them to be good. That tendency has cost me a great deal in my life. I asked Fletcher directly in his office, which smelled like toner and sugar-free mints, if there was a program inside our program. He smiled, the way men do when they have prepared for a question by rehearsing the shape of the answer. He told me that what we had found was extraordinary, and that extraordinary things require containment. He used the phrase prophylaxis of risk. He told me I was listed in a file as being significantly entangled with the event, and that for my sake, and for the sake of everyone else, we would be managing my sensory inputs to reduce coupling. He didn't say I was dangerous. He didn't have to. I asked him if any part of this had to do with stopping something or starting it. He said stopping and starting were words for machines smaller than this. Oddly, that made me feel safer. The days folded back on themselves. I would wake with the sensation of having just ended a thought I couldn't retrieve. My notebook entries began to look like someone else's handwriting. Helen and I kept working, because work is a way to be brave without telling anyone. She disappeared for 2 days with no message, which put me against the windows of my own home in a way that made me understand what animals feel in tornadoes. When she returned to the lab, she had a band of adhesive on her arm and eyes that wouldn't settle. She handed me a photo taken through a polarizing filter. The inscriptions glowed faintly, not like light but like thermal overlays on a cold day. She tapped the brightest spot. "Panel," she said. "It wants us to think it's a panel." We decided, without saying the word, to try to open what I had joked about as a seam, and had learned not to call that. The tools on hand were pathetic against a material that didn't owe us an angle. I held a small pry with 2 fingers and the kind of care you reserve for birds. When metal met metal this time, the hum swelled and found a chord. The room lost its sense of being attached to the building around it. The seam widened by a width too small to have a name. Beneath it was not darkness. It was a density that ate description. A little gust of something invisible but measurable crossed the space between us. Our hair announced it. Every instrument with a time base stuttered. I said the word "stop" to myself and believed I had said it aloud. The alarm went off in the hallway, not the fire alarm, the other one, the one that told everyone that someone had opened a door that should have remained closed. The hum kept its head. Fletcher arrived with 2 men who looked like they could lift lab benches without having to tilt them. He stepped into the room, and the men did not, which told me he believed more in his instructions than his body. He told us it was enough. He used my first name like a sedative. Helen looked at him with the soft pity she reserved for fools and left the tool on the bench, palms open. I watched the seam pinch itself closed, as if we had imagined it. That night the hum followed me home like a smell on my clothes. My watch on the dresser still insisted on the hour I had branded it with, and the second hand had taken on the role of a thing that exists to disappoint. When the house drifted into the kind of sleep that isn't, an email arrived without a sender field. It contained a set of numbers that at first looked like nonsense and then like a date in a format I recognized from a different life. The date sat in the future, but not far. Underneath the number, one line, "Choose your star." I closed the laptop like that could keep the thought from entering the room. I met Daniel Kessler in a park where old men exercised their dogs and their patients. He listened without interrupting in a way that made me feel like I was dictating to a machine that wouldn't lie to me. I gave him a printed transcript of the hum's base pattern and the date. He asked me what I thought it meant. I told him I thought it meant the sphere was a clock that counted not hours or orbits, but events so large that nouns failed us. I told him I thought I had started it. He asked me what starting meant. I said touch and attention. He told me that was how most machines begin. We parted like men who had taught each other something thin and useful. The morning the date arrived, the lab was staffed by men and women who had been trained to pretend to be invisible. Helen wasn't there. The panel line on the sphere had a color that moved around inside it like heat shimmer. I wrote down, in my quiet, domestic notebook, the exact time and the latitude and longitude of my own body, as if that could keep me inside it. The hum began. The long gaps elongated. Something registered in the building, in the way a bridge registers a truck. The inscriptions stopped changing. For a moment, I believed in mercy. Then the lab lights went to a dim that wasn't a work mode. The pattern in the hum shifted in a way that made my gums ache. On the scope that we kept tuned for noise, a new family of peaks climbed like a city skyline. They were not harmonics. They were cousins. I put my hand on the bench to keep from moving it somewhere stupid. The sphere made no motion. It made a decision. In my head, not in my ears, not in the room, I saw what a choice looked like when it was made by a machine that kept time with births and endings rather than springs. Two threads coming together, not intertwined, just touching. It didn't choose a star. It chose an observer. The observer was the person it had begun to trust because he lacked the imagination to stop touching it. A printout somewhere in the building spat out paper with a date stamp. It wasn't the date we were on anymore. It was the date the email had given me, then crossed out by the printer itself and replaced with the word passage. That was when I decided to stop helping. There are decisions that make you smaller and keep others large. There are decisions that keep you the shape you can live with. Turning away from the object didn't break the hum. It broke me into pieces that fit inside the life I had promised other people. I called Helen and left a message on a system that still used tape, because I believed in plastic moving across a head more than I believed in particles moving across a country. I told her we were being used as hands on a clock face, not readers of a text. I told her that the thing wasn't from somewhere else. It was from all of this, but without us. She called back from a number I didn't recognize and said the simplest true thing. Then don't be a hand. The line clicked as if someone had hung up for her. At my apartment, the knock came again. 3 precise raps, not loud, delivered by a knuckle that had learned manners. I opened the door because the timing had convinced me that my life had already been chosen for me before I was even asked the question. Fletcher stood there, tie loosened, as if he wanted to appear late in the day. He said my name like an apology. He told me there would be an adjustment in where I worked and when. He told me there was no malice, only momentum. He offered me a place in a facility with no windows and more air than we would ever need. I asked him if he believed himself a villain. He took a breath I couldn't measure and said, "No, Robert, we are a gasket. The world needs them more than it knows." In that moment, I believed him in the way you believe a bridge you have to drive across. I did not go with him that night. I asked for a day. He gave it to me because cruelty wasn't what he did. I packed my notebook and the small recorder and the printouts, and I drove to a storage unit that had housed old furniture and teenage mistakes. In the back behind a rolled rug I still felt guilty about, I had placed a case that held a copy of the lab sound captured on a day before I started losing nights. I set up a second-hand laptop on a plastic crate and began to transfer the file to a device that wasn't on any network. The progress bar climbed, staggered, climbed. At 97%, the building's lights went out. The hum reshaped the air. My phone vibrated on the crate with a message from a number with no digits. It contained a single character. I stared at that little, therefore, until the power came back and the transfer reported complete. When I opened the file and pressed play, I heard birdsong. What I realized then felt simple. The sphere wasn't emitting some cosmic will. It was obeying laws that were only strange to us because we had never tracked them over spans wide enough to see their shape. It counted alignments the way we count birthdays and funerals. It had been placed where it would survive and waited for something with enough self-awareness and the right shape of attention to put a finger where a finger should go. Perhaps the thing we fear isn't malice from outside. Perhaps it is being told we are finally connected to the everything we say out loud we want to be connected to. The men and women who had wrapped me in white coats and confidentiality weren't monsters. They were trying to keep the world from wearing a clock as a collar. I wanted to hate them. I found I couldn't. It is not an absolution. I don't know when Helen left the program exactly. I received one postcard with no return address and a picture of a river that could have been anywhere in America. On the back, a scribble in her hand. Instructions are a mercy. I tried to read more in the pressure of her pen strokes. I failed. Daniel sent me a newspaper clipping, a blank space where a story should have been, with a correction at the bottom about a layout error that would be remedied in future editions. He wrote in the margin, "A good layout knows what to leave out. We stopped trying to be clever." Cleverness hadn't kept anyone safe. Fletcher saw to it that my days were structured. He had me consult on experiments where nothing too violent happened to time. I sat in rooms with smart people and pretended to forget everything that had brought me there. I took the adjusted medicine, which blunted the edge of wonder, and left behind something that could go to the grocery store without looking at the fluorescent bulbs for too long. The watch on my dresser remained a memorial to an hour the world had visited and then decided to abandon. While shaving, my eyes would drift, and for a second the mirror held a man older and younger than me, as if all my possibilities had hired the same barber and come in one after the other. At some point, I looked up my name in the mission logs that anyone can read, the kind that school children are asked to do projects on. I was not there. It felt less like an erasure than like a failure to be born. In an odd way, the absence comforted me. It meant the clock had not eaten everything. It meant some of us could still walk down the street without being asked to autograph someone else's memory. I keep the recorder in a drawer now. Some nights I pull it out and press play. Most of the time it returns nothing. Every now and then, it offers the low, patient beat that started all this, with the long gaps, just as they had been on the surface, the moment the seam considered us as variables. I do not trust what I'm hearing. I write it down anyway. The little composition notebook has been replaced half a dozen times. The first line on the first page is a refrain. Do not trust any recording after 0200. I don't know if I wrote it first or if I copied it from a previous life that made better choices. This, then, is my unauthorized report, not an exposé, a maintenance log for a life that took on too much static. The sphere was older than the numbers we like to use to make ourselves feel less small. I can say that without needing a lab. The dating methods we trust describe families of decay and recombination. The object wasn't part of that family. It sat outside, as if the universe had loaned it to us with a note about treating borrowed things with care. If you ask me where it is now, I can't tell you. Not because I am dramatic, because not knowing this protects you and me both from choices we should never have to make. Some evenings, as the streetlights come on, and the city tries to decide what color its night is, my jaw hums where it meets the skull. The melody that arrives is a thing I've tried to ignore into silence. It shifts when I pay attention to it, like the inscriptions did. If I sit very still and stare across the room and see the edges of the bookshelf without seeing the books, the hum resolves into the outlines of larger rooms. I feel the weight of stars in their patient long arcs, and the improvised way matter forgives itself for being in different places at once. I think of Charles out there on his knees in dust that never thought it would know our names. I pretend I can't hear him still describing the hinge. Fletcher called me once at a human hour. He asked if I was well. I told him I was maintaining. He laughed, not cruelly, and said maintenance was beautiful. Before we hung up, he said something that rattled in me like a good bolt in the right hole. If it had wanted us dead, Robert, it wouldn't need a clock. He's right. I hold to that when the thrum behind my ears climbs in a room that hasn't been built yet. On a morning like any other, the email arrived again with no headers, no sender, just a date and beneath it, choose your star. I did what you do with intrusive thoughts. I put it in a drawer. I made coffee with attention to grind and temperature. I watched steam choose air. Later, passing the dresser, I glanced at the watch and caught the second hand trying to lift itself. It failed. I imagine it will try again tomorrow, maybe the day after. I can't tell if I'm the one moving the hand or if a larger machine is doing it through me. If you ask me why I've written any of this down, I can say this. I wanted to leave a record, not of revelation, but of a man who did a job and touched something that recalibrated him. We like to believe that secrets end with confession. In practice, nothing ends cleanly. If I had the authority, I would put a tag on this. Out of service, awaiting parts. I'm not waiting for absolution or for the pattern to stop changing when I look away. I'm waiting to find out if the hum in my head belongs to me anymore. At night, when the quiet in the apartment accumulates into something with mass, I hear not a knock at my door but a careful sound inside the walls, the kind electricians make when they are being considerate with someone else's house. I tell myself it's nothing. The house doesn't answer. The clock in the other room remains at an hour the world left me inside. I get up, write a sentence I won't remember, and go back to living in a time I can only call mine because I don't know what else to name it.